The Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution of 1917, which led to the fall of the Tsarist monarchy and the rise of communist rule under the Bolsheviks, was a pivotal moment in world history. Russia, a vast empire plagued by economic inequality, poor working conditions, and political corruption, was ripe for revolution. The revolution's first phase, the February Revolution, overthrew Tsar Nicholas II, ending centuries of Romanov rule. The second phase, the October Revolution, was orchestrated by the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks aimed to establish a socialist state that would eventually lead to a stateless, classless society, as envisioned by Karl Marx. After the Bolsheviks seized power, they faced immediate opposition from both internal and external forces. The Russian Civil War, 1917–1923, was the brutal result of this power struggle. The Red Army, representing the Bolsheviks, fought against the White Army, a coalition of monarchists, liberals, and other anti-Bolshevik factions. The war quickly devolved into widespread chaos and violence, with the Russian countryside ravaged by brutal conflict. Both sides committed atrocities, but the Bolsheviks, determined to secure their power, unleashed terror in the form of the Red Terror. The Soviet government executed tens of thousands of class enemies, including former Tsarist officials, clergy, and peasants resisting collectivization. The war was further exacerbated by the involvement of foreign powers, such as Britain, France, and the United States, who supported the White Army in an effort to undermine Bolshevik control. These interventions added to the bloodshed and suffering. Famine and disease spread across the country, contributing to an estimated 7 to 12 million deaths during the Civil War. The devastating human cost of the revolution and the Civil War set the tone for the years to come under the Soviet regime. With Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin rose to power and transformed the Soviet Union into one of the most repressive states in history. Stalin's policies, driven by a brutal vision of industrialization and collectivization, were the primary forces behind widespread suffering. The first major policy of Stalin's rule was collectivization of agriculture, which aimed to consolidate small farms into large state-controlled collective farms. This led to massive resistance from the peasantry, particularly in Ukraine, where millions were subjected to forced requisitions of grain and livestock. The result was the Holodomor, a man-made famine that ravaged Ukraine from 1932–1933. Millions of Ukrainians perished as the government seized their food, leaving the population to starve. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it is widely believed that between 3.5 to 7 million people died as a result of the famine, which some historians consider a deliberate act of genocide. At the same time, Stalin's Great Purge, 1936–1938, targeted perceived political rivals and potential threats within the Communist Party and across Soviet society. Thousands of military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were accused of being enemies of the people. Many were executed or sent to the notorious gulag labor camps. The exact number of deaths during the purges is difficult to determine, but estimates suggest that 700,000 to 1.2 million people were executed during this period. The labor camps, in which prisoners were subjected to forced labor under brutal conditions, became another site of mass suffering. It is estimated that over 1 million people died in the gulags from starvation, disease, and harsh working conditions. Stalin's rule was not only marked by physical repression, but also by psychological control. The government instilled a culture of fear and surveillance, where citizens were encouraged to report on each other, and even the slightest suspicion of dissent could lead to arrest and execution. This atmosphere of constant terror permeated all aspects of Soviet life, and Stalin's legacy remains one of the most blood-soaked in world history. Mao Zedong's vision for a communist China led to the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, following a long and bloody civil war between the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, and the nationalist Kuomintang, KMT. Mao's rise was fueled by his promises to free China from imperialist domination and to create a new society, based on equality, land reform, and the elimination of class distinctions. However, Mao's implementation of communist policies would bring great suffering to the Chinese people, with two major events, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, defining his violent reign. One of Mao's first major policies, after the founding of the People's Republic, was the Great Leap Forward, 1958-1962, an ambitious plan to rapidly industrialize China and collectivize its agriculture. The policy called for the forced collectivization of rural farms into large communes, where the peasants were expected to work together to increase agricultural production and support rapid industrialization. However, the plans were poorly executed, and the communal farms were inefficient. Agricultural production plummeted, leading to widespread famine. The Great Chinese Famine, which occurred during this period, is considered one of the deadliest man-made disasters in history. Mao's insistence on continuing the program, despite the crisis, exacerbated the situation. Millions of peasants were forced to grow crops that were not suited to the land, and the government requisitioned grain from the countryside to support urban areas, even as millions starved. Estimates of the death toll from the famine vary, but between 15 to 45 million people are believed to have died from hunger, malnutrition, and disease. In many rural areas, entire villages were wiped out. The famine's devastation is still a sensitive topic in China, with the government reluctant to acknowledge its full scale and impact. Mao's second major campaign, the Cultural Revolution, 1966-1976, was aimed at consolidating his control over the Communist Party and reasserting his vision for China. Mao feared that the Chinese Communist Party was becoming too bureaucratic and that the country was deviating from revolutionary ideals. He called for a mass movement to eliminate counter-revolutionary elements within the party and society, which led to the rise of the Red Guards, radical youth groups who were encouraged to attack intellectuals, teachers, and perceived enemies of the revolution. The Cultural Revolution quickly spiraled into widespread chaos and violence. The Red Guards conducted violent campaigns of persecution, including physical and psychological abuse of perceived class enemies. Intellectuals were particularly targeted, and many were publicly humiliated, tortured, or killed. Mao's forces also destroyed much of China's cultural heritage, including temples, books, and artworks that were deemed old and counter-revolutionary. As the revolution escalated, the military took control and purged the most radical elements of the Red Guards. But the violence continued. Political purges were rampant, with Mao's rivals in the Communist Party arrested, tortured, and executed. An estimated 1.5 to 3 million people were killed during the Cultural Revolution, and countless others were sent to re-education camps where they were forced to undergo ideological training. The Cultural Revolution devastated China's economy, society, and education system, and left deep scars on the nation. The chaos also contributed to widespread disillusionment with Mao's leadership, and after his death in 1976, the government began to distance itself from many of his policies. Mao's legacy remains deeply controversial, with millions of lives lost due to his radical and often brutal approach to achieving communist ideals. The Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, took control of Cambodia in 1975 after a brutal civil war that saw the Communist Party of Kampuchea, CPK, overthrow the US-backed government of the Khmer Republic. Pol Pot and his associates aimed to create a radically agrarian society, eradicating all elements of urban life, capitalism, and Western influence. They sought to implement a Marxist-Leninist vision that would see Cambodia transformed into a purely agricultural, self-sufficient nation. However, the implementation of this ideology led to one of the most brutal genocides in modern history. Upon taking power, the Khmer Rouge immediately initiated their radical plan, which included the forced evacuation of urban centers. Phnom Penh, the capital, along with other cities, was emptied of its population as the Khmer Rouge forcibly relocated people to the countryside. The regime considered the urban population to be corrupt and sought to dismantle the traditional structure of society by eliminating the educated, intellectuals, and anyone deemed part of the old capitalist or imperialist system. As a result, an estimated 2 million people, or roughly a quarter of Cambodia's population, were forced to relocate to labor camps or rural communes. The Khmer Rouge's policies of extreme collectivization and forced labor were designed to create a classless society, but they quickly descended into a nightmare. Intellectuals, professionals, teachers, doctors, and even anyone who wore glasses or spoke a foreign language were targeted for execution. The regime's paranoia and cruelty turned Cambodia into a prison state. Those accused of being enemies of the people were often killed in mass executions, and those who survived the initial purges were subjected to grueling labor conditions in the fields, where they faced starvation, disease, and extreme physical punishment. The term killing fields has come to symbolize the scale of death and horror that occurred under the Khmer Rouge. Tens of thousands of people, including men, women, and children, were executed in mass graves across the country. Victims were often transported in trucks, taken to remote areas, and killed with primitive tools like pickaxes, machetes, and shovels to save ammunition. The regime's primary method of eliminating its perceived enemies was through execution squads that operated with terrifying efficiency. It is estimated that between 1.7 and 2 million people, about a quarter of Cambodia's population, died as a result of the Khmer Rouge's policies. These deaths were caused by execution, forced labor, starvation, and disease. The Cambodian genocide remains one of the darkest chapters in Southeast Asian history, with the regime's brutal policies leaving a lasting trauma on the Cambodian people. The trial of former Khmer Rouge leaders in the 21st century, particularly the trial of Pol Pot's associates, has brought some measure of justice, though the scale of the suffering and the lasting effects on Cambodian society are still evident today. The Korean War, which began in 1950, was a defining conflict of the Cold War and one of the most violent episodes in modern history. The war arose from the division of Korea into two zones of occupation following Japan's defeat in World War II. The Soviet Union controlled the North, while the United States controlled the South. This division eventually led to the establishment of two rival Korean states, the Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, and the pro-Western Republic of Korea, South Korea. The North, led by Kim Il-sung, sought to reunify the peninsula under a communist government, while the South, supported by the United States and other Western powers, opposed this. In June 1950, the Korean War erupted when North Korean forces, under Kim Il-sung, invaded South Korea, with the aim of unifying the country under communist rule. The initial success of the North Korean army drove the South Korean forces into a retreat, and they were soon supported by UN forces led by the United States. In turn, China intervened on behalf of North Korea, sending massive waves of troops to help the North push back the UN forces. The Korean War quickly escalated into a bloody, devastating conflict. It was characterized by intense and brutal fighting, large-scale bombings, and countless atrocities on both sides. The war resulted in the deaths of an estimated 3 million people, with civilians suffering disproportionately. The war caused massive displacement, with millions of people fleeing the fighting, and resulted in widespread destruction of infrastructure and homes. The war was not just a military conflict. It was also a deeply ideological struggle, with both sides committing atrocities. In the North, there were mass executions of South Korean prisoners of war and civilians suspected of being collaborators. On the South Korean side, UN forces, particularly American forces, committed war crimes as well, including the mass killing of civilians and the widespread use of napalm and artillery bombardments. The Korean War ended in 1953 with an armistice agreement that established a ceasefire, but did not result in a formal peace treaty. The Korean peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel, with a heavily fortified demilitarized zone, DMZ, separating the two countries. This division remains one of the most militarized regions in the world, and tensions between the two Koreas, as well as between North Korea and the United States, have persisted ever since. The Korean War left deep scars on both North and South Korea, with millions of lives lost and both countries permanently divided. In North Korea, Kim Il-sung consolidated power after the war, establishing a totalitarian regime that would endure for decades. The country became a Stalinist state, with an extreme personality cult surrounding Kim Il-sung and his descendants, which continues to this day under his grandson, Kim Jong-un. North Korea's communist policies have led to widespread poverty, isolation, and repression, with the government regularly engaging in purges and executing perceived enemies of the state. On the other side, South Korea, while initially devastated by the war, eventually emerged as one of the world's largest economies, benefiting from significant American support and adopting a more capitalist economic system. However, the scars of the war, including the psychological trauma of division and the constant threat of North Korean aggression, remain evident in the South. The Korean War also had profound implications for the Cold War. It was the first major, armed conflict of the Cold War era, and set the stage for the broader global confrontation between the communist and capitalist blocs. The war entrenched the ideological divide in East Asia, with the Soviet Union and China supporting North Korea, while the US and its allies backed South Korea. The war's legacy continues to shape geopolitics in East Asia, with tensions between the two Koreas, the US and China, remaining high. The Vietnam War, which took place from 1955 to 1975, was one of the most significant and devastating conflicts of the 20th century. It was deeply intertwined with the global struggle between communism and capitalism, and its effects would reverberate throughout Southeast Asia for decades. The war was fought between the communist forces of North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and the Republic of South Vietnam, backed by the United States and other Western allies. It was a brutal and controversial conflict that involved extensive military intervention, guerrilla warfare, and profound human suffering. The roots of the Vietnam War can be traced back to the end of World War II, when Vietnam, which had been a French colony, declared its independence under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. The French, however, sought to reassert control, leading to the First Indochina War, 1946-1954, which ended with the Geneva Accords. These accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with Communist North Vietnam led by Ho Chi Minh and a non-communist government in the south, initially under Ngo Dinh Diem. The division was meant to be temporary, with national elections, to reunite the country scheduled for 1956, but the elections never took place. Tensions between the two sides escalated into a full-scale war, with the U.S. increasingly involved in supporting the South, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. This period marked the beginning of America's involvement in the region, which would grow dramatically in the 1960s. By the mid-1960s, the U.S. had escalated its military presence in South Vietnam under the leadership of President Lyndon B. Johnson. The U.S. military relied on conventional warfare tactics against the Viet Cong, the communist insurgents in the South, and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA. However, the war in Vietnam was unconventional, as the Viet Cong waged guerrilla warfare, blending in with the civilian population and using the dense jungle terrain to their advantage. The U.S. used airstrikes, including the extensive bombing, campaigns known as Operation Rolling Thunder and Operation Linebacker, to destroy North Vietnam's infrastructure and supply lines, including the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail. The use of napalm and Agent Orange, a herbicide designed to destroy the jungle and deprive the Viet Cong of cover, resulted in widespread environmental damage and the death or maiming of millions of civilians. The war became increasingly unpopular in the United States as the death toll mounted, with over 58,000 U.S. soldiers losing their lives and 2 million Vietnamese civilians killed. The U.S. also faced growing opposition from the anti-war movement, which saw the war as an unjust and unwinnable conflict. The war's brutality and the extensive use of violence against civilians shocked the world and left a legacy of deep scars in Vietnam and the broader region. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords resulted in the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam, but fighting continued between the North and South. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, marking the end of the war. The country was officially unified under communist rule, and Vietnam became a single-party state. The consequences of the war were catastrophic. The U.S. faced not only military defeat, but also a deep crisis of confidence at home, with many questioning the efficacy of its interventionist policies. In Vietnam, the war left a shattered economy, millions of casualties, and a society that had been ravaged by years of conflict. The war also caused significant refugee crises, with boat people fleeing the country in the wake of the communist takeover, and mass casualties in neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos, which were also affected by the expansion of communist movements. The Vietnam War, often called the American War in Vietnam, remains a painful chapter in the region's history, and its effects continue to influence Southeast Asian geopolitics to this day. The Cuban Revolution, which culminated in 1959, was one of the most important events in Latin American history, as it marked the first successful communist revolution in the Western Hemisphere. Led by Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and other revolutionary figures, the revolution sought to overthrow the dictatorial regime of Fulgencio Batista and address the severe inequalities, corruption, and poverty that plagued Cuban society. The revolution had wide-reaching implications for both Cuba and the broader Latin American region, as it inspired other left-wing movements while also drawing the ire of the United States. Fidel Castro's journey to power began in the mid-1950s, when he led a failed attempt to overthrow the Batista regime. After being imprisoned, Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he met Che Guevara, an Argentine revolutionary. Together they planned their return to Cuba, where they gathered a group of rebels and launched an armed guerrilla campaign against Batista's government in 1956. Their forces, though small, gained widespread support among the Cuban peasantry and urban workers, especially due to their anti-imperialist rhetoric and promises to end corruption and inequality. By 1959, the revolutionary forces had succeeded in toppling Batista's regime. Castro's victory was celebrated as a triumph of the Cuban people over imperialism and exploitation. However, as Castro moved to consolidate power, he implemented a radical agenda that included land reforms, nationalization of industry, and the redistribution of wealth. These policies were designed to benefit the Cuban people, but they also placed Cuba at odds with the United States, which had long seen the island as a key part of its sphere of influence in the Americas. The Cuban Revolution occurred during the height of the Cold War, and Castro's communist leanings made him a target of U.S. hostility. In 1961, just 2 years after Castro took power, the U.S. attempted to overthrow him in the Bay of Pigs invasion, a botched operation that humiliated the American government. The U.S. imposed a trade embargo on Cuba, which remains in place to this day. Castro, in turn, strengthened his alliance with the Soviet Union, seeking military and economic support from Moscow. The Cuban Revolution also had a ripple effect throughout Latin America, where it inspired a wave of left-wing movements. Castro's success served as a model for guerrilla warfare and the overthrow of entrenched oligarchies, particularly in countries like Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. The U.S. viewed this spread of communism in its backyard as a direct challenge to its dominance in the Western Hemisphere, and sought to contain it through both covert operations and direct intervention. Under Castro, Cuba became a one-party state, and the government implemented sweeping reforms that radically transformed the country. Education and healthcare were significantly improved, but Cuba's economy stagnated due to the U.S. embargo and the inefficiencies of the centrally planned system. Castro's regime was also marked by widespread political repression, with thousands of political dissidents imprisoned, executed, or forced into exile. The Cuban Revolution also had profound effects on Latin America. While it inspired many revolutionary movements, it also led to increased U.S. intervention in the region, including the funding of anti-communist military regimes and the support of counterinsurgency campaigns. Many of these actions resulted in widespread human rights abuses, including torture, disappearances, and executions of suspected communists and leftist sympathizers. In the long term, the Cuban Revolution, while securing many social achievements for the Cuban people, also led to enduring political and economic isolation. Fidel Castro's eventual retirement and the slow normalization of relations between Cuba and the U.S. under Barack Obama did little to erase the bitter legacy of Cold War tensions. The revolution remains a controversial subject in Latin American politics, symbolizing both the potential for social change and the dangers of authoritarianism. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the definitive end of the Cold War and signified the most significant failure of communist ideology on a global scale. For much of the 20th century, the Soviet Union, under the leadership of the Communist Party, was the primary bastion of communist thought and governance. The fall of the Soviet Union did not just mark the disintegration of a superpower, but also the collapse of a vision for a Marxist-Leninist utopia that had inspired revolutions and political movements worldwide. Its dissolution also led to the end of communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the eventual emergence of democratic governments and market economies in many former Soviet states. Several factors contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had been on a path of internal decay for decades. The centralization of power under Joseph Stalin and his successors created an inherently inefficient political system that stifled economic innovation and adaptability. The rigid state-planned economy, which had initially succeeded in industrializing the country, became increasingly inefficient in the face of global economic shifts. As the Soviet leadership continued to prioritize military spending over domestic needs, especially during the arms race with the U.S., the economy began to stagnate in the 1970s and 1980s. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the Soviet Union was in a state of crisis. Gorbachev's perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, political openness, were attempts to reform the system, but they inadvertently exposed the deep flaws within the Soviet state. While intended to address economic inefficiencies and increase political transparency, these reforms instead led to increased public dissatisfaction and calls for greater freedom. Moreover, Gorbachev's decision to abandon the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had previously justified Soviet intervention in Eastern Europe to suppress anti-communist movements, opened the door for political change across the region. The most significant, immediate consequence of Gorbachev's reforms was the wave of revolutions that swept across Eastern Europe in 1989. For decades, the Eastern Bloc had been under tight Soviet control, with communist governments that were installed or heavily influenced by Moscow. However, by the late 1980s, rising dissatisfaction with these regimes, along with the weakening of Soviet authority, led to mass protests and the eventual collapse of communist governments in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Wałęsa, had been challenging communist rule since the early 1980s. By 1989, Solidarity had grown so strong that it negotiated a peaceful transition to a democratic government, effectively ending communism in the country. Similar movements in Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia led to the overthrow of communist regimes and the peaceful establishment of democracies. The most dramatic event of 1989 was the fall of the Berlin Wall, which symbolized the collapse of Soviet control in Eastern Europe and the potential reunification of Germany. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961 to separate East and West Germany, had become the symbol of the Cold War division between the Communist East and the capitalist West. As East Germans began to demand greater freedom and the Soviet Union stopped enforcing the wall, it was opened, and soon after, the reunification of Germany took place. By the end of 1989, communism had fallen across most of Eastern Europe, and many of these countries moved toward democratization and integration into Western institutions, like the European Union and NATO. In Romania, however, the overthrow of Nicolae Ceausescu was not peaceful. The brutal dictator was executed along with his wife, ending the last communist regime in Eastern Europe. As communism crumbled in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union itself was teetering on the edge of collapse. The various Soviet republics, many of which had been subjected to heavy Russian dominance for decades, began to push for greater autonomy or independence. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, and 15 independent republics emerged, including Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Central Asian nations. This event marked the formal end of the Cold War and the dissolution of a superpower that had been a central player in world politics for nearly half a century. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a direct result of internal political, economic, and social crises within the communist system. Despite the widespread belief that communism would inevitably lead to a more equitable and just society, the Soviet Union's eventual dissolution demonstrated that the ideals of Marxism-Leninism were not able to overcome the system's inherent contradictions and inefficiencies. The fall of the Soviet Union also left a power vacuum in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which led to regional instability, the rise of oligarchic elites in Russia, and ongoing conflicts in countries like Ukraine and Georgia. While communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union has largely been replaced by capitalist democracies, the legacy of communist rule remains deeply embedded in many of these societies. In countries like Russia, Czechia, and Hungary, there are still significant populations that look back on the communist era with nostalgia, viewing it as a time of stability, employment, and social welfare. However, the overwhelming majority of former communist states have embraced liberal democracy and free market economies, though the transition has often been fraught with challenges. The collapse of communism also led to the enlargement of the European Union and NATO, with many former communist countries seeking to align themselves with Western Europe and the United States. The integration of former communist states into these institutions marked a profound shift in global geopolitics, as the former Eastern Bloc countries moved decisively away from Russian influence. While the failure of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe is a testament to the limitations of totalitarian systems, it has also shaped the geopolitical landscape in the post-Cold War era.